Um, International approaches to stress and interventions. So I've been asked to talk about the case for primary approaches or not. Actually, that's my little bit. I added that, and the UK approach. So the first thing I'd like us to do is when we think about stress, and particularly in the context of where we are now, we often have this appearance that we expect workers to be unbreakable, don't we? So our workers should be fireproof, bulletproof, shatterproof, waterproof, trauma-proof. Isn't it interesting that a good worker is an unbreakable worker? But actually, that doesn't really apply now, does it, when we talk about a pandemic? Because no one is pandemic-proof. So for me, a lot of the things that we took for granted and we took as being the norm are changing. So we have a new norm, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later. And that new norm isn't just for a few weeks. That'll be a very different workplaces and different places of work that we go back. And what we'll see is an increase in stress. And I will present a figure, which is a model, which shows you the stress reaction curve, which I think is really important to have a look at. So this we've had a little pause on my slide. There we go. So a lot of us are used to working under pressure. So anyone that's here, if you've ever seen a tire, the function of a tire is to keep on rolling and that you put pressure and it carries on. But if you've ever actually been behind a truck when a tire is blown, it's a very interesting experience. And the point is, actually, although we get pressure, we get to a point where excessive pressure becomes too much and they break out. So why is it a primary issue? Because often that pressure is asserted by the organization and the individual is the tire, and they're expected to expand and expand until actually the tire blows up, which is when the individual cannot take any more pressure. And plus, I'm a psychologist and I like the psychiatrist here. And increasingly, we have caseload management systems, which we just keep adding files to until we fall over. Interesting, 25 years ago when I first started in the National Health Service and I went to HSE, we used to have files. And if you walked into an office and it was full of files, you'd be like, what's all that about? You know, technology now allows us to carry around on our iPhones, Samsungs or Blackberries, up to 10,000 files. Now, if you had 10,000 files in your office, it would be considered a bit cluttered and overdone. So what we have got is all these technology and changes that have happened in the last 20 years, particularly around the capability to store information. But what we haven't done is actually put limits on how much information people can and can't have. So for me, primary, it's not about saying how well my person is going to cope all on their own, because you can put people through resilience training. But if you give them too much work, if the work is too excessive, then something's going to give way. And you know, if you've ever seen a vice, the vice doesn't break. It's what is inside it that gets gradually squashed and squashed. So what we have, you know, is that we've got a workforce that's constantly being moved and manipulated to get more and more out of them, but we're not actually releasing that level of pressure. But that's okay, because we give people stress balls, and you can hold your stress ball. You can do anything you want with that stress ball. If you squeeze it too long, though, you get repetitive strain injury. If you can imagine that, you know, that sort of going through your mind. So stress balls are ineffective. But if you've got really bad stress, we give you an even bigger ball that you can hug, and somehow that'll make you feel better. And I am going to have a go at those what I class as tertiary interventions, because a stress ball, some physical stuff doesn't make a difference. Nor does drinking, although in some people they may enjoy a drink, but long term, if you keep drinking, you're going to have ill health outcomes. This is obviously I'm Martini, because we all like to be James Bond in our spare time. You could stroke a cat or a dog. That might be therapeutic, unless you've got an allergy, obviously, to an animal. You can bring your cats to work day or bring your dogs to work day. Again, nice, makes the dog and the cat happy, but actually, does it actually make any difference, real difference to people, in particularly in tackling what are the issues in the workplace? Primary, we know, is what the organization is doing. Secondary is how they're training and equipping their people, and the tertiary is where the bulk of the activity we see now in the stress arena occurs, and it's ineffective. You could always bang your head here because that's going to be effective, except I used to work in neuropsychology, and it's not very effective for stress reduction. If unconscious, cease stress reduction activity. But what we can do, and I want us to have a look now, is if we think stress and critically meant the mental health of our employees is a recent thing, that we've got this generation of people that are not able to cope. Yerkes-Dodson's law 1908 was stating at that stage that if people get too much pressure, they become stressed and anxious. And equally, if they don't get enough pressure, they become bored, and that is equally stress-inducing. Now, what we want to do is have people in the central of this curve here, so that actually they're getting some pressure. But think about where we are now with COVID-19. Okay, we've got a group of people that are in the boredom area, so they're subject to stress. We've got a group of people that are highly anxious, highly stressed, because some of them are under different workloads or they're working in a work environment that I didn't want. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. Because I can hear someone. Cool, I can just hear someone in the background, but I was just making sure I wasn't waffling on my own. So actually, what we have here is an example from 1908. This is 10 years before the Spanish flu pandemic. And we know from the Spanish flu pandemic and subsequent recessions and pandemics that there is a psychological stress reaction to those situations. We're in the current situation we find ourselves in is unique, but it is unique in that it will change the very essence of the way we work. But what interesting for me is people say it's only in the last 25 years. I don't agree. Aristotle was talking about what he described as stress in his early writings. Being a priest during the Reformation, stressful. Being down the mine shaft when you saw when the canary was dying, also stressful. So let's not buy into the fact that we've just got a group of weak people. What has changed is the way we work. The primary element of what we need to be doing. And then what we decided when we were looking at those issues was we were going to look at how do you manage work-related stress. So this brings us to a small intervention about the management standards, which I will show you later, which is an assessment of work-related stress factors in the workplace: demands, control, support, relationship, role, and change. Being the ones that are prevalent. We know demands, control, and support is Karasek's model, and relationships of role and change incorporates the role and organizational justice, Greenberg's organizational justice. Basically, the principle is high demands, low control, low support is seen in most cases. High demands, control, and support as relationship, role, and change are all organizational constructs, and they need to be managed by the organization. I am now talking to people, though, who are saying actually the factors that are impacting them are control and support, because demands is being leveled because people are not necessarily, in some instances, not able to do as much work. So what people are saying is the lack of control because of the current situation is impacting them, as is the fact that they have a lack of support. Now, if you've got a lack of control and lack of support because of the pandemic, and because you're actually at home, you're working at home, you're not getting the same support systems in place, well, relationships and role can help to reduce that. If you've got good relationships and you're clear of what your role is during this period of this pandemic, that will help. But whichever way we look at it, the same principles of the management standards still apply. So we're looking to control these 6 areas to bring about better behavior. And why are we trying to do that? Well, this is our statistics from the UK. This is last year. 15.4 million days lost to work-related stress. That's 239,000 new cases last year alone. of which nearly 600,000 workers were suffering from work-related stress, depression, and anxiety. Okay, if you look at the bottom figure, which is per 100,000 workers, you can see the increase going up over the last 5 years. Okay, what is interesting is during the last 5 years, we've done loads and loads on health and well-being. But much of the stuff that we've done on health and well-being has been at the tertiary level and has not sought to address the primary issues. The management standards was born out, which we've just seen, was born out of the fact we had 9 million days lost to work-related stress in 1999, and we were freaking out at 9 million days. And at 15.4 million days, that is the most days lost for any condition since we've started collecting stats. It represents 57% of all working days lost to ill health. So whilst we've focused on doing health and well-being, we haven't done health and well-being and the primary at the same time. So my plea to you is, if you do the tertiary intervention, you must do the primary intervention. And if you look at Anthony Lamontinet's paper from 2007, which reviewed what interventions work, you will see that meta-analysis showed that primary interventions with secondary interventions or with tertiary interventions would be effective, whereas tertiary on their own would not have an influence. So what do we do when we do the management standards? We get people to do the 5 steps of the risk assessment. We ask them to go through all 5 steps. The key being is that at the center of it is a management commitment. To seeking to implement a risk assessment based approach. The UK law and legislation requires organisations to do a risk assessment for the management of ill health in the workplace, and so we require them under UK legislation to do a risk assessment, and we require them under that risk assessment to act accordingly based on the findings of that risk assessment. So it is a requirement under health and safety legislation. Just going back to the previous slide, the 15.4 million days is extrapolated across the globe. In different countries where you collect data, stress is on the increase. So it's not just a UK Pacific thing, it's happening everywhere, and is likely to have an increase as we come out of this pandemic also. So what have we done to do that? We said, we want you to do a risk assessment, and we want you to look at these 5 areas. We want you to specifically to evaluate your risk by talking with your people and finding out what the risks are and looking for appropriate interventions. But to do that, we gave people this talking toolkit, which is available on our website. And what it does is it helps to start that conversation around work-related stress. Because most people say, well, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. What kind of things should I be looking for? So we've given them this guide, and we've now put that online. We've got paper versions, and it takes people through a proven process to help them do the 5 steps of risk assessment. But this brings me out of the management standards and into an area where I think we really someone's phone's ringing. Right. So for me, as you might have gathered, I think there's an imbalance. And why? Because I think we're concentrating way too much on the tertiary interventions, too much on resilience and too much on mindfulness. Today I will live in the moment, and unless that moment is unpleasant, in which case I will eat a cookie. And how often do we tell people to go and manage their own stress or manage their own mental health, and then we put them back into toxic organizations? And we say, we want you to be emotionally resilient, and we want you to be mindful of your workplace so that you can get through the issues that are there. But what if at the heart of it, the workplace is the source of the problems? I once did a conference, and at the end of it, a number of people were coming up to talk to different speakers. One gentleman had waited around 10 minutes to chat to me, and he said, "I love what you said." And I said, "Oh, great." He said, "But I've got one issue." And I said, "Well, what's that?" And he said, "Well, I put all of my staff on resilience and mindfulness training." And I said, "Well, okay." And he said, "Half of them come back and said they hate their job." And he said, "No one told me when I made my people aware that they need to be mindful that that's what would actually happen." Now, the point is, I said to him at that point, "What would you do?" And he said, "Well, I've got to go back and look at the organizational factors." And I said, "Yeah. And if you do look at the organizational factors, then these mindfulness and resilience approaches that you've got will probably work in tandem and will work effectively." So if the balance isn't right, we need to shift. And for me, the left the left of that scale should be, to bring us back into balance, should be on the primary interventions, looking at primary approaches. We now, with the numbers of work-related stress cases we have, we know we can move that in terms of our government and other people are listening. It shouldn't have got to 15.4 million before organizations went, "Oh, geez, what should we do?" So what I'd like to do is, I think we need to shift the balance and shift it back. And this brings me to the last section of this talk, where I want to talk specifically about where we are now with COVID-19 and why I think there is something that we need to consider now and going forward about people's mental health and about the impact of work-related stress. We are going to change the way we report and look at stress because of the very unique circumstances that COVID-19 is providing. We've got to be ready to be able to support people, and I'll come to that. I'll come to why that is in a second. What people are really wanting now is, we want a normal life. We want to go back to whatever normality is. I live on my own. I've been in this house for 8 weeks, and I don't see anyone. I don't live with anyone. I go out for walks and I randomly wave at people that I might know. And only in the last week have I been able to meet with one other friend who happens to be my best mate and have a talk. So we want a normal life, okay? But at the same time, we're under this cloud of, what does a normal life look like? Does going back to work actually cause people more anxiety and more stress? Now, if we've isolated ourselves in lockdown, we put ourselves in this safe place that this house is, what happens when you get out of this house and you get on the first train, or you get a bus to work, or you use public transport? So you're already going to have people coming into work with heightened anxiety because social compliance and social distancing may not be achievable or may not be observed as people are going into work. Then we're going to go into work and we're going to expect people to socially distance in work when they never have. We may, in some countries, expect people to wear PPE where they've never been expected to wear PPE before. All of these things lead us into a different mindset than we currently are. Because at the moment, where we are in this adaptation zone. So this is the green bit at the bottom. Hopefully, you can see my mouse moving around here. But let me just take you to two things. One, people, when they're going into a conflict situation, and this is based on preparing troops for going into the field of battle, but it's actually very, very good also to describe where we are at the moment. We get in February, and towards the end of January and February, we get a slight increase in people's personal distress, okay? This is where we begin to see anxiety and mild cases of depression. That gradually increases till we're at the point where, whatever, depending on what country you're in, you're called in. That's it. You've got to go. You go to lockdown. Okay. So that curve drops really quickly because you've now got to adapt, because you're in this zone where you have to adapt. So when you're working at home now, you're adapting. You're okay. It's in a safe place. We've reduced the curve. We've done all this, but actually, you got to come out of that conflict situation. So you got to come out of where we are now. And when you do come out of where we are now, look at this. And this is the really important thing. Look how steep that curve is when we come out. And that is the reaction of the stress reaction and the mental ill health that we're likely to see coming out of this pandemic. And if we don't do something now to apply the primary principles that we're talking about, we are going to be left in a situation where tertiary interventions in this phase here will not be suitable and sufficient. They won't actually allow people to feel comfortable at home or comfortable in a workplace. We're going to have to realize that we need to be starting to talk to people now in this adaptation zone. We need to be working with our teams to get people ready for going back into the workplace, but going back into a very, very, very different workplace, a workplace that will look like nothing like the one, in some cases, that they left 3 months ago. And if we don't do that, if we simply go, you're going to go back to work, you need to be emotionally resilient, you need to be mindful, and when we don't address the organizational issues, the primary issues, that your workers are going to go off quick, and they're going to be going off ill. We know from China and from Italy that healthcare workers have been impacted hugely because they've been in this resilient point where they're working and working and working, and then as they've come out of it and they've had time to sit back and think about what's happened, many of them are also experiencing mental health issues now. So the organizations, whilst they've come through it, need to manage that and manage that coming through. I know I'm working with a colleague who actually used to be a captain in the special forces, who gave me this model, which is from the Green Berets, but he's now working in ITU. He's a psychologist in Sweden, and how you prepare people for after as well as during the pandemic. As Morgan Freeman says, as we work to find our new normal, we need to help each other to stay strong and hopeful. So the new normal is what we have now, and it's what's coming. And in that new normal, you will need more than ever primary interventions to tackle the issues that are there. We cannot simply go back to the old way and go, we're going to deal with individuals. We're just going to teach you how to cope. We're going to teach you how to manage. We're going to have to say, what do we do as an organization to help you in this new situation? Because when you get into an office and you're asking people to socially distance and observe a whole new set of rules, that isn't just a physical barrier, that's a psychological barrier. And actually people's psychology and how you care for them and how you support them through that will be as valuable as the physical barriers that are there. And we are going to have to carry that on for many months. It's not just going to be a month. You know, we're hearing 6 to 12 months of this social distancing. So we're going to have to continue to have a new way of working. And I believe that this new way of working will fundamentally change that whole idea to open plan offices and various different other things. And I think we are well equipped in health and well-being to deal with that, because we've done all of this excellent work over the last 5 years. But what we need now is all of that excellent work, but also the organizations to step up to the mark and realize that they have to manage it themselves as well, that they can't just rely on their individuals. And that's the end of my presentation, which was exactly 25 minutes, Valerie. So
excellent, Peter. Thank you very much. Very powerful and I think very relevant to what's happening today. Do you have any concrete examples of approaches for workplaces in terms of primary prevention? I think acknowledging that it is a new normal and dialoguing about that, I guess. But do you have anything else, or is there anything else that the HSE has pulled together yet in that regard?
Yeah, well, we've done a new stress guidance. Sorry, you can hear me, I hope. Yeah,
we can hear you.
We've done new guidance on how to prepare people psychologically for return to the office. So that's looking at the management standards that are there. I would recommend a number of different resources. The World Health Organization has a briefing paper on people on stress or on mental health and COVID and returning and also the ILO has a really good reference, as does the Canadian Mental Health Service. Norman will give you the correct title.
Okay.
The Canadian Mental Health Commission. I mean, you guys. I mean, you are actually doing some mega wonderful things when it comes to primary intervention. I'm hugely impressed. I went and had a meeting with the commission when I was in Canada last year, and we are definitely clinical foes and brothers and sisters in arms, because you do get it and you are doing it. And actually, some of the illustrations from the guidance that they've put out is exceptional. And I would be guiding you to look at that as well as our stuff from the World Health Organization and NIHU, and look around at companies that are successful. Right, each year, the Times and the New York Times do a top companies to work for 500 lists, and in those, majority of the top 100 all have very successful health and well-being programs, so they're doing the tertiary, but what they are doing is assessing their primary intervention. So they're saying, what do we do about how we work and make the work a place that helps people to thrive? I talked recently about work should be a place that promotes health, doesn't hibernate ill health, and I think we have solely focused too long on saying you, the individual, must do something, which leads to the 15.4 million days lost. But I see very small enterprises and I see large enterprises doing stuff on work-related stress and doing stuff on mental health and taking it seriously. So there are a range, and I'm happy offline and if you come on my LinkedIn, you can contact me there, and maybe you sort of share those. So yeah, there are good ones out there, and there are some that just really aren't good. And they are, interestingly, the ones that I was reviewing a lot of different organizational interventions. The ones that are struggling now, the ones that are the ones that were essentially focusing just on the individual. And I've seen actually two of those that I knew had very strong individual interventions. They've gone under. So it just goes to show, doesn't it, really, that if you do the primary element, you protect the business from a range of possible threats, not just the fact that it is the right thing to do is to manage people's health at work. It's actually the concrete thing to do to manage to keep that organization healthy. People who are engaged and feel their work looks after them are people that stay. They're not people that move. They're people that commit themselves to the organization. So yeah,
that's true.
Yeah, and I have a wonderful view here. I can't share it with you, but I live on the outskirts of a city, and there's a small little eagle, not like your eagles, but a small little eagle that's flying around above my garden, which is very nice.
Good, as long as it's not after your cat or your pet, I guess that's okay.
Yeah, our eagles are only the size of smaller than cats, so don't worry. They're not like yours. You're big eagles. I've seen them.
Peter, there was one question.
It's muted, so I can't hear you.
Sorry, thanks. How well is the management standard enforced? And it's hard enough to get other health hazards dealt with, much less stress, especially where women are concerned. So it's a kind of a multi-layered question around how well is the management standard enforced with respect to stress, I think, is really the question.
Okay. So if we're honest, and I've been pushing for regulation on work-related stress and using the management standards for nearly 14 years. When we first launched it, we had a series of cases, but they very quickly were resolved. And then the governments at the time took a decision to encourage organisations to follow the risk assessment process and not to formally do any regulatory activity. But for a number of, certainly for the last 2-3 years, as I've been saying to my organisation, our numbers are increasing. All our inspectors are trained on work-related stress because I train them. Where we're in that position where we should be saying we will look at cases. So we will So what we've done in September is we put out a new criteria for what we will investigate, and it's a criteria that we'd already had, but it's a criteria that was very difficult to find, whereas now it's front and center out there. So if the right cases come along, we will enforce, and we will do regulatory activity. We can only enforce on two things though, and that is the failure to risk assess, which is enshrined in the management regs for health and safety at work, and that's Reg 2, and also in Reg 5, which is once you know you've got a problem because you've done your risk assessment, you need to do something about it. But but below that sits the Health and Safety at Work Act, which puts a duty on the employer in Section 2 to manage the health of their employees, which includes their mental health. And that's where we've only ever taken the cases on those two levels. So yeah, you can do it, but you've got to be clear that it's more than one case, that there's a series of cases. There has been some consultation. The employer or the organization is aware of it. And there's been a failure to act on that intelligence. So you could argue if you've done a risk assessment, you know you've got problems, you do nothing about it, then that's a breach. So if you're going to do a risk assessment, you should do something about it. And yeah, and returning to the gender issue, there is a reporting suggestion that women will be experience higher levels of stress. But well, that was really interesting because this was something that's been following in the last few years. If you look at the gender issue now, it's leveled. So it's not just women or men, it's the fact that something about the way we work is impacting anyone's gender and anyone's. So I think, and if there's ever a leveling exercise, this pandemic is it not? You know, because it doesn't matter what gender you are, if you're sat in your office and you're in social isolation, you know, it's that kind of. This is why I think. You know, we have a very short window of opportunity to make sure that we don't have an explosion of mental illness, because after every major recession or financial collapse or pandemic, SARS, Ebola, in the countries where this is it, you see an increase in mental health. Okay, so if you think it's not going to happen, then you're avoiding all the evidence that suggests it's going to happen. So that's why that figure of doing something now, do the primary interventions now, assess what you as an organization need to do, and then you won't need a visit from a regulator, hopefully. Well, fingers crossed. You might still see it, but there you go.
Yeah, exactly. And in Canada, there isn't as detailed regulation unless it's around harassment and violence, for instance. And even then, it's, you know, the regulation is you have to have a policy and a program, not necessarily, which includes an element of violence risk assessment, but certainly not for stress. So,
yeah, I mean, we don't regulate violence. Isn't that interesting? Violence and bullying, that's done by another department. But here's the interesting thing: the law has defined that the employer is vicariously liable if their employee is exposed to bullying or violence from co-workers, members of the public, or others who are in that workplace. But we don't take cases on violence and bullying, and they go through the Equality Act, which is a piece of legislation, and it's the Equality Commission that deals with that. I personally think they should all be included in the round, but that's, you know, I'm not the person that made the decision about 20 years ago, so.
That's interesting. So thank you.